The snow had been falling since noon, and by the time the last buggy left our lane, the whole valley had gone white and silent. I remember standing at the kitchen window with a dish towel in my hands, watching the lamplight from our neighbors' houses shrink one by one into the dark. It was Christmas Eve. The pies were cooling on the sill, their crusts still ticking as they settled. The children were finally asleep upstairs, all 4 of them tucked under quilts my mother had stitched by hand before she was gone. And behind me at the table, my husband sat very still, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands, waiting for something he believed was his to ask for. I did not know yet what he was going to say, but I knew the look. I had learned that look in 11 years of marriage, the way you learn the weather by the color of the sky. And before the clock over the stove struck midnight, he would say the words, and I would have to decide, standing there in my own kitchen, what kind of wife I was going to be. Before I go any further, I'm Martha. This is Hannah, the Amish girl, the channel where I share the stories we were never allowed to speak out loud. I grew up old order Amish, and I lived that life as a wife and a mother for many years before I finally left it. If you value hearing the truth about plain life from someone who actually lived inside it, and not the tourist version you see from the road, subscribe and tap the like button, and tell me in the comments what you think an Amish husband is allowed to demand of his wife on the holiest night of the year. I want to know what you imagine before I tell you what is real. Let me explain something that most people outside our world never understand, because it changes how you hear everything that comes after. In the Amish world, Christmas is not what you picture. There is no tree. There are no colored lights strung along the porch, no wrapped presents in bright paper, no music playing from a radio, because we had no radio in the house at all. Christmas Eve in my community was quiet, plain, and heavy with meaning. We read the Christmas story from the book of Luke by the light of a single lamp, my husband's voice low and even, the children still and round-eyed on the bench. They might receive one simple gift, a hand-carved toy, a new pair of mittens, a small twist of paper with hard candy inside. The day was holy. It was set apart. And that phrase, set apart, is the whole key to everything I am about to tell you. Because in our world, the marriage bed was governed by rules that almost no one ever said out loud. The Ordnung, our unwritten but iron code, shaped every hour of our lives, what we wore, how we cut our hair, how we spoke, how we prayed. And yes, what happened behind the bedroom door once the lamp was blown out. And woven through all of it was a calendar of holy days. Certain nights of the year were considered sacred. Nights of fasting, nights of preparation. Nights when the body was meant to be turned toward God and away from the flesh, when a household was supposed to hold itself quiet and reverent before something larger than itself. Christmas Eve, in the strictest understanding of the old people, was one of those nights. Here is the part that will surprise you. In the theology I was raised in, a husband was the head of the household in all things, and a wife submitted. Completely. That teaching did not pause politely at the bedroom door. A husband could, in the plainest terms, expect his wife to yield to him whenever he chose. Her comfort was secondary at best, and most of the time it was not mentioned at all. Her readiness was rarely considered a thing that mattered. This was simply understood. It was never taught to us as girls in any direct way, never spoken over the wash basin or at the quilting frame. We were expected to absorb it the way you absorb the cold, without anyone ever explaining to you why the winter comes. But the holy days complicated everything. On a night set apart for God, the older women in my church would say, quietly, almost sideways, that a righteous husband restrained himself. That true faithfulness on such a night meant turning toward prayer, not toward the body. So there were 2 rules living inside the same house, and they contradicted each other completely. A husband may lead, and a wife must yield, and a holy night belongs to God, and the flesh must wait. And a wife was left standing in the narrow, freezing space between those 2 things, with no map and no compass, expected to somehow already know the way through. I married Jacob when I was 19 years old. He was a good man in most of the ways that a community measures a man. He worked from before dawn until after dark. He provided. He never once raised his hand to me or to the children. He read scripture aloud every evening in that low, steady voice, and the little ones loved the sound of it, would fall asleep in the middle of a psalm with their heads against my arm. By the world's measure and by the measure of my church, I had married very well, and the older women told me so at every frolic and every funeral. But Jacob believed in the first rule far more deeply than he believed in the second. He believed that a husband's authority did not bend or pause for anything on the calendar, not for a fast day, not for a feast day, not for the eve of the holiest night of the year. And I had spent 11 Christmas Eves learning, quietly, in the dark, exactly what that belief meant for a woman like me. That night, the one I am telling you about, the snow kept coming down past the window in slow, heavy curtains. I dried the last dish and set it in the rack. I wiped the counter that was already clean. I could hear the house settling around me, the tick of the stove as it cooled, the wind pressing its shoulder against the window panes, the deep and total quiet of 4 children asleep. And I thought, the way I had thought on other nights, if I only move slowly enough, if I only stay busy enough, midnight will come and the holy night will hold, and he will not ask me for anything at all. Stay with me here, because what happened next is the whole reason I am telling you this story, and I promise you it is not what you think. Jacob set down his coffee cup. He said my name, once, softly, the way he always did, and then he told me what he wanted. He did not shout it. He did not force it. He did not even raise his voice. He simply said it, the way a man states a fact that he considers long since settled, on a night that the old women had told me all my life belonged to God and not to us. And I stood there in my own kitchen, on Christmas Eve, with flour still dried white on my apron, and the pies cooling behind me, and I felt those 2 rules tear at each other inside my chest like 2 hands pulling a seam apart. Because I had been taught every single day of my life to obey him, and I had also been taught every single day of my life that this night above all others was set apart, and no one, not my mother, not my grandmother, not the bishop, not one living soul in 29 years had ever once told me which of those 2 rules was the one I was actually allowed to follow when they finally, inevitably, collided. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here, not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits and I have learned exactly where they are, so I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down, 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me tell you about my friend Rebecca, because her story is the one that finally cracked something open in me. Rebecca married 2 years before I did, into a district even stricter than my own. She was a quiet woman, quick with a needle, the kind who never once spoke above a whisper at the quilting bees, who kept her eyes on her stitching while the other women talked. For years I thought she was simply shy. It took me a long time and a great deal of my own pain to understand that what I had been watching all those years was not shyness at all. It was a woman who had learned very early how to make herself very small, how to take up almost no room in a room. One winter afternoon, we were kneading bread together in her kitchen, the 2 of us alone, our sleeves pushed up past the elbow, flour to the wrists, the yeast rising warm and sour in the air. And out of nowhere, without ever once looking up from the dough beneath her hands, she told me that in her house the holy nights meant nothing at all, that her husband made no distinction whatsoever between an ordinary Tuesday in March and the sacred eve of a feast, that she had once dared to ask him, gently, carefully, whether they ought not to keep such a night for prayer, the way the old women said a godly couple should, and that he had told her, flatly, that a wife who questions her husband is a wife already guilty of pride. Hochmut. The greatest sin in all our world, the one they warned us about before any other. And so she had stopped asking. She had folded that question up small and put it away somewhere deep inside herself, the way you fold and put away a dress you know you will never again be permitted to wear. I remember standing at her counter with the dough going still and heavy under my own hands. understanding for the very first time that the silence I had been living inside was not mine alone. That there were kitchens all across that valley, warm and flowery and quiet, where women just like me were kneading bread and swallowing the exact same question. That every single one of us had been handed a rule we could not follow, and a rule we were forbidden to question, and then told that the freezing space between the two of them was simply what it meant to be a good and faithful wife. Rebecca said one thing to me that afternoon that I have never once been able to forget. She said, "They gave us 100 rules for the cows and the garden and the wash on the line. They gave us none at all for this. And then, when we did not know, they blamed us for the not knowing." There was another woman, too, older than both of us, named Anna, who had been married nearly 40 years by the time I knew her well. I had always thought of Anna as a hard woman, unsmiling, her mouth set in a permanent line. But one summer, when I sat with her while she was ill, she told me in a low voice that she had spent the better part of her marriage believing that what she felt on those nights, the wish to be asked instead of told, was itself a kind of wickedness in her. That she had confessed it silently to God for years, as though wanting gentleness from her own husband were a thing she needed forgiveness for. And I sat there by her bed, holding a cup of cooling tea I had brought her, and I realized something that frightened me more than anything I had understood before. The silence did not only take our girlhood, in those first raw years of a marriage. It could take an entire life, all 40 years of it, right down to the very last of them, and then convince a woman at the end of it that the theft had somehow been her own fault all along. Anna died that autumn, and I have never stopped thinking about the fact that she went to her grave still half believing that the thing that had been done to her had been a sin she committed. Now I want to be fair, because fairness matters far more to me now than anger ever did. Jacob was not a monster. I need you to understand that clearly, because it is so easy to hear a story like this one and turn a man into a villain, and the truth is almost never that simple or that clean. Jacob had been raised in exactly the same silence I had been raised in. No one had ever taught him to ask me what I wanted, because no one had ever taught him that what I wanted was a thing that existed in the world at all. He had been handed the first rule, the rule of the husband's God-given authority, and pressed it into his hands like a tool, and he had never once been told about the second rule, the one that might have set that holy night gently apart. The silence had failed him too. It made him certain in the exact place where he should have been gentle, and it never once gave him the words to be anything other than what it had made him. That is the truest thing I know about the silence I grew up inside. It did not only wound the women, it hollowed out the men from the inside, and then it turned around and called them the head of the house. When I finally left the Amish world, I was 31 years old, and the cost of it came down on me immediately and without mercy. The shunning. The meidung. My letters returned unopened, my own handwriting staring back at me from the envelope. My mother's voice going silent on the other end of a borrowed telephone in a stranger's kitchen, until all I could hear was her breathing. And then not even that. The door of the house I had been born in closed and bolted against me, and my own father standing somewhere behind it, choosing the ordnung over his own daughter, because the ordnung had spent his whole life teaching him that this was the faithful thing, the righteous thing, the only thing to do. And in the years that came after, in a small quiet room with a therapist who was endlessly patient with me while I learned an entirely new language from the ground up, I finally heard words spoken aloud that I had never once in my life been given. Consent, autonomy, boundaries. The strange and enormous idea that a night, any night, even an ordinary one, could actually belong to me. That my body had never been a possession to be handed across a table from my father to my husband on my wedding day, like a deed to a piece of land, but had been mine, wholly and completely mine, the entire time, even on all those nights when every single voice around me had insisted with total certainty that it was not. My therapist said something to me once, early on, that I have carried with me every single day since. She said that control does not always look like a locked door and a raised hand. Sometimes control looks like a question you were never once permitted to ask. Sometimes it looks like two rules that flatly contradict each other, handed down together to a young girl who is then told that figuring out the difference between them is her job and her burden, and when she cannot, her failure, and finally her sin. I grieve now for the woman I was on that Christmas Eve. Standing at the kitchen window with the snow coming down in sheets, 29 years old, 4 children asleep in the rooms above me, holding one rule in each of my open hands, and no idea on this earth which one God actually wanted me to keep. I want so badly to reach back through all these long years and take her by the shoulders and tell her that the confusion she felt that night was not weakness, and was not faithlessness, and was not sin. It was the entirely reasonable, entirely human response of a person who had been set an impossible task from the day she was born, and then quietly blamed for every time she stumbled at it. But I will not stand here and lie to you and tell you that world gave me nothing, because that would be its own kind of dishonesty, and I am finished with dishonesty. The Amish world gave me a community with a depth and a texture that most people will never in their lives know. Neighbors who showed up for every birth and every burial and every barn raising without ever needing to be asked. It gave me a work ethic that has carried me on its back through every hard and uncertain year since I left. It gave me a faith that I have had to wound and wound again, and rebuild once more, but which is still, in some quiet and stubborn and unkillable place inside me, entirely real. I can hold both of those truths in my 2 hands at the very same time. The community that raised me was beautiful, and I mourn it. And the silence living inside that community failed me on the holiest night of the year, and it failed Rebecca in her flowery kitchen, and it failed Anna for 40 long years, and it failed Jacob, who never knew any better, and it failed women whose names I will never know, kneading bread in kitchens all across that white valley, swallowing down the very same question that I swallowed. There is no scripture anywhere that makes a woman's silence holy. There is no theology that truly requires her to stand alone in the dark between 2 contradicting rules and call her own confusion faithfulness. And there is no God that I believe in now who would design a woman with such care, and then intend for her to spend the holiest night of the entire year unable to say a single word about what was happening to her, in her own home, in her own bed, on the night we were all taught belonged to Him. If you grew up in a world where obedience was confused with readiness, where an honest question was treated as a sin against God, where you were handed a rule you could not follow, and a rule you could not question, and then told that surviving the freezing space between them was simply your job as a woman, then I see you. I truly do. Your comfort matters. Your voice matters. What happens inside your own one life matters. And if no one in your entire world ever once said those plain words to you out loud, then I am going to say them to you right now, tonight, wherever you are. Tell me in the comments what part of this stayed with you and settled somewhere it will not leave. Tell me your own story, if you are finally ready to tell it. And if you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.